Hilfe, Hilfe, es gibt ein Feuer! There's a fire on our farm! Hello and welcome to an episode of Prash's Murder Map. This one is going to be a bit different. Once in a while, I'm going to present a Murder Minis episode, tantalising you with blood-stained, bite-sized stories that aren't long enough to make into a full episode, but are all chilling in their own right. Today we're going to look at 5 cases, each one just a few minutes long, all taking place in the late 1800s. There are some interesting themes running through these cases, which I'll talk about a bit more at the end, so see if you can identify the aspects that keep coming up. So hold tight and get ready to have your blood curdled. Hilfe, Hilfe, es gibt ein Feuer! There's a fire on our farm! In the 1800s, it was rare for crimes committed outside England to reach the Illustrated Police News, also known as the IPN. It was a popular newspaper, sold for sixpence to bloodthirsty readers eager to learn about the most recent shocking crimes. But in 1868, a rare article appeared telling the tale of a horrific slaughter in Germany. Johann Toda and his wife Margaretha owned a farm in Schleswig-Holstein in North Germany. They had 5 sons and a daughter who all helped on the farm. The country life was idyllic, but beneath the surface and gentle tinkling of cowbells and the cheerful sowing of crops, there was an undercurrent of something sinister brewing. There was one member of the family who made everyone uneasy. The second eldest son, Tim, was 23 years old. He was known to be argumentative and was frequently on bad terms with his father and brothers, but although everyone knew he had a bad temper, nobody could have guessed what it would one day lead to. One day in August 1866, Tim Toda ran to his neighbours calling for help, shouting that there was a fire on their farm. Once the fire was put out, the villagers were shocked to find the rest of the Toda family inside the partially burnt barn, blood-stained and charred. Tim's parents, 4 brothers, a sister and the servant girl, were all dead. At first, people suspected a gang of robbers, but when the police arrived, they found nothing to suggest a break-in, and nothing had been stolen. Police interrogated Tim Toda, knowing that there was bad feeling between him and the rest of the family. Ultimately, he made a full confession, and this is how he did it. He crept up behind each of his 4 brothers, one after the other, while they were working the land, and beat them to death with a 5-foot handspike, which is a long wooden or metal pole. This is probably a common tool that manual farm labourers would use to plough a field. When his father arrived home, Tim told him that the oxen had broken loose. Johann Toda rushed out to try and catch them, but while he was distracted, Tim waylaid him and struck him down with a handspike, just like his brothers. He brought his father's body to the barn using a cart. Then he killed one of their 2 watchdogs and tried to kill the other, but it broke free. His mother came rushing out of the house to find out what the noise was about. Before she had a chance to realise what was happening, Tim killed her with a hatchet before giving his sister Anna and the servant girl the same treatment. He stacked all the bodies in the barn and set fire to it, hoping that all the evidence would be burnt beyond recognition. His maniacal words as he watched the roaring flames licking at the timbers of their family home were chilling. "Ha! I have them all dead." Had his plan worked, he would have inherited the farm and become a wealthy man. He would have received a sizable sum, as he would not have had to share it with any of his siblings. The police were horrified by his calm demeanour as he related the story of his crimes. He seemed to show no emotion at all. Tim Toda was found guilty and executed on the 13th of May 1868, but the memory of the flickering flames and his violent murders lives on. The shooting of a station master. Mr. Edward Adolphus Walsh was not a popular station master. He ran a tight ship at Dover Priory Station in Kent, South East England. If any of you listeners ever visit Kent, I'd recommend seeing Dover Castle, with its far-reaching views across the channel from the famous White Cliffs and a guided tour through its secret wartime tunnels. In the 1800s, the job of a station master was tough, but was rewarded with a high social standing, and they would be given a station house to live in so they didn't have to travel too far to work. However, it meant they worked long hours and spent most of their lives near the tram lines, the rhythmic clacking and chugging a constant backdrop to their days. Walsh, like all station masters, would have had responsibility for all staff at his station and was a figure of authority. He hated sloppy work and did not think highly of young carriage cleaner Thomas Wells, frequently berating him for doing a poor job. The feeling was mutual. Wells was once heard telling a colleague that if Mr. Walsh fired him, he would have his revenge. Sure enough, in May 1868, Walsh told Wells that his conduct was not good enough. Even worse, he'd been seen firing a pistol while on duty, but Wells firmly denied it. Walsh told him to go away and think about his behaviour, probably planning to sack him very soon if his attitude did not improve. As Walsh sighed after the trying conversation and sat back in his office chair to study the day's timetables, he jumped in surprise as Wells burst into the room clutching a rifle. He said nothing and calmly shot Station Master Walsh in the head, killing him instantly. Wells hid in an empty carriage, but was soon found by police. His earlier anger forgotten, he handed over the rifle willingly and walked quietly to the police station. An insanity defence was presented, as Wells had fallen off a train a few weeks before the murder and landed on his head. His family testified that he shouted and swore at the slightest provocation and had once thrown his mother out of her bed in the middle of the night. But as no medical advice had been sought after his accident, and nobody else other than his family thought there was anything wrong with him, the defence plea was ignored. Thomas Wells was hanged at Maidstone Jail on 13th of August 1868. He is remembered for more than just his rage-filled murder, as he was the first person to be executed in private inside a prison rather than publicly. Unluckily for him, the hanging was botched and he slowly suffocated to death. As an interesting footnote, some people argue that the popular Illustrated Police News was a bad influence, as a copy was found in Wells' pocket after he was arrested. Whether reading stories of murder and mayhem encouraged the young man to do it, or whether he was always destined to become a killer, is something we will never know. The Chelsea double murder. The Reverend Elias Llewellyn had obviously forgotten the Bible quote about it being easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He had retired from his work as a minister of the French Conformist Church in Soho and assistant chaplain at Brompton Cemetery, and had since built up an enviable portfolio of fashionable houses in Chelsea. By 1870, he was 84 years old and earning a good income. He collected his rents himself, walking his dog through the London streets and earning a reputation for being rather careless about exposing the jingling golden guineas in his purse. In May of 1870, he decided to renovate one of his houses at 24 Wellington Square and hired some workmen for plastering and wallpapering. One of them was 31-year-old Walter Miller from Scotland. When Llewellyn paid his workers, Miller couldn't help but notice all the gleaming coins in Llewellyn's possession. The retired reverend mentioned to the workman that he was going to Lincolnshire for a while to visit a friend. It was the worst thing he could have said. When nothing was seen of Llewellyn for several days, everyone presumed he had gone to visit his friend as planned. But things became strange when an eccentric looking man arrived with a waxed moustache, pince-nez glasses and an exaggerated French accent, claiming to be Llewellyn's nephew. He moved into 15 Portland Square, Llewellyn's main residence, and told people that the old housekeeper, Anne Boss, had gone with her employer to Lincolnshire. In her place, the French nephew hired a less than respectable looking woman and took charge of his uncle's affairs, collecting his rents on his behalf and generally living the high life. Nobody thought any more of it until one evening he sent for a removal man, Henry Piper, and asked him to remove a large trunk from the kitchen of 15 Portland Square to a house in Fulham, another one of Llewellyn's properties. When Piper lifted the trunk, he saw blood streaming out of it.
"What does blood do here?"
"Go back, you carman. Cord the box and do your work." Piper refused. "Go back and cord that box," the Frenchman insisted again, but his accent had changed to a Scottish one. Now, I apologise for the terrible accent. As you can probably tell, I'm absolutely rubbish at doing accents. So that was my attempt at a Scottish one. Piper realised something was wrong and sent his assistant for the police. The fake Frenchman fled, with Piper in hot pursuit. After half a mile, the imposter slipped and fell and was arrested by the puffing policeman, Sergeant Large, bringing up the rear with the assistance of Mr. Piper. And yes, his name really was Sergeant Large. They went back to the house, prized open the trunk, and found housekeeper Anne Boss inside, who had been strangled with a rope. It soon became obvious that the fake French nephew was in fact Scottish workman Walter Miller in disguise. It was then found that while he had been previously working in the house at 24 Wellington Square, he had ordered a large hole to be dug in the garden. Inside the hole, the police found the body of the retired Reverend Elias Llewellyn, who'd been knocked down from behind with a shovel, then strangled to death. The double murder caused widespread horror and alarm. Miller was a mean-spirited, jealous man who was envious of people better off than himself. Had he got away with his ruse, he was planning to escape to America with his newfound wealth. Unusually, he had no criminal record until this point. He was sentenced to hang at Newgate, but didn't want the executioner to have the pleasure of it, so he tried to run headfirst into the wall of his cell to dash his brains out, but he underestimated the strength of his skull and was dragged to the gallows on August 1st, 1870. Piper the removal man received a reward of £50 and as a special treat for his help in catching the criminal was permitted to watch the execution. It proved to be a grisly sight as the drop was too short and he was slowly strangled. Eventually, Llewellyn's real nephew Edward inherited the properties. Unfortunately, the houses proved hard to let as people didn't want to live somewhere tainted with such a bloody history. Famous occultist Aleister Crowley lived nearby at 31 Wellington Square for a time and took an interest in the sinister number 24, but was reportedly disappointed that it was not haunted. The houses still stand today, although they are now mostly apartments over shops, and the road has changed beyond recognition. I wonder if the customers of McDonald's and Starbucks know what happened just feet away 150 years ago. West Bromwich Murder, 1871. What do two drunk miners, blackmail, a charred body and a warlock have in common? Believe it or not, they were all part of a very strange murder in West Bromwich in the Midlands of England. On June 25, 1871, in the early hours of the morning, an engine driver, Isaac Blockridge, saw smoke coming from one of the windows at the Hall End pits. These were very small homes, little more than huts or hovels, inhabited by poverty-stricken colliers who worked in the nearby coal mines. Blockridge knew one of the miners who lived here, called Joseph Marshall, known as Lame Joe. He quickly hurried inside to investigate, but recoiled at the noxious stench of burning meat. Coughing and waving the acrid smoke away from his face, he saw something he would never forget. What he saw was like something from a nightmare. What he saw was a body. It was lying in front of the fireplace and was so badly burnt that only the head was left intact, clear enough for Blockridge to see that it was Lame Joe. Choking back nausea and fright, he ran to call the police. When they arrived, they found that Lame Joe had been hit in the head 3 times with a blunt instrument, hard enough to smash the skull. A blood-stained rake nearby looked likely as the murder weapon. The story of what happened soon became clear, although the reasons for it would never be definitively proven. The night before, Lame Joe had been seen drinking with fellow miner John Higginson, for some odd reason known as Black Jack. They had often been seen together, but were not always on friendly terms. Last night, they had been heard screaming at each other and almost getting into a fistfight while drinking at the Nag's Head Tavern. Black Jack's landlady said that after the drunken man had arrived home around 11 PM, he had fallen asleep by the fire. But by 3 AM, he had woken up again and went out, cryptically saying that he wanted to pick some mushrooms. After an hour or so, he returned looking dishevelled and anguished. When asked, he said he hadn't found any mushrooms. 3 witnesses had seen him go to the Hall End hovels and stated that when he came out, there was a smell of burning. Black Jack was urged to have a look at the corpse in the morning, but he said he didn't want to see it. You or I would consider this perfectly normal, that he had no wish to view a blackened corpse before breakfast, but in those days people flocked to murder scenes with ghoulish interest, often looking for a small item to take away as a souvenir, like a lock of hair or a brick from a wall. Shortly after this he was arrested. He seemed confused and did not admit to the murder. The defence did their best and said that Lame Joe had provoked a fight and Black Jack had struck him without meaning to kill him, despite the fact there had clearly been 3 blows to Lame Joe's skull. Black Jack escaped the noose, but was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to penal servitude for life. Nobody ever knew why he had done it, but there was talk in the town. Lame Joe had a reputation for being sly, probably because he was unfortunately cross-eyed, and in those days people were quick to ridicule or mistrust anyone who looked different from themselves. Black Jack was superstitious, and it's been suggested that Lame Joe had threatened to put the evil eye on him. With his threat hanging over him, Black Jack was effectively blackmailed into giving Lame Joe money and paying for his ale during the frequent trips to the Nag's Head Tavern. The story goes that Black Jack got sick of the blackmail and consulted a local warlock known as the Sedgley Wizard, who advised him that the only way to avoid being cursed was to kill Joe and burn his body. I wonder if Black Jack thought it was worth it to get rid of the evil eye, but at the cost of spending his life behind bars. The sinister parcels. Running a brush manufacturing business was not exciting enough for Henry Wainwright. What he really dreamed of was being in the theatre. He lived with his wife and 4 children near his 2 brush factories at 84 and 215 Whitechapel Road in London's East End. The lights, the glitter and the excitement of the stage all appealed to him in ways that brushers just couldn't, but the closest he could get to it was to seduce actresses. Harriet Lane was his 19-year-old mistress who he met in 1871. He paid for her lodgings and gave her £5 a week. Even his business income couldn't cover his expensive tastes, and he found himself nearing bankruptcy, partly thanks to the cost of keeping a second permanent mistress, ballet dancer Alice Day. The truth was he had inherited the company from his father and had no idea how to run it properly. He and his family downsized and moved to a smaller house, but he soon realised he had to do something more drastic about his ongoing expenses. Harriet Lane was becoming a problem. Not only was she making drunken, jealous scenes about his pursuit of other women, she was costing him too much money. On September the 10th, 1874, he took her to his brush factory, shot her in the head and slit her throat before burying her under the floorboards in the workshop. What a charmer. To explain her sudden disappearance, he told everyone she had gone to Europe with a friend. Shortly after, the factory burnt down, and Henry Wainwright called on his insurers, but he was out of luck. They knew about his financial troubles and suspected deliberate arson, so they refused to pay a penny. In 1875, Wainwright went bankrupt. A solicitor, Mr. Berrand, took over the lease of 215 Whitechapel Road, and all was well for a time. But as the heat of summer wore on, the tenant complained about a disgusting smell coming from the back of the workshop. Wainwright passed it off as rotting cabbages, but the tenant was unsurprisingly not convinced and quickly moved out. Berrand advertised the house for sale, and Wainwright realised he had to do something, worried that the next owners might be more thorough in exploring the source of the smell. Henry Wainwright asked his brother Thomas to help, which wasn't for the first time. Thomas already knew about the murder, and had even impersonated Harriet Lane's fictitious suitor, who she was supposed to have gone to Europe with. Evidently, he had an interest in the theatre like his brother. Something else they shared was a lack of business acumen, as his ironmonger shop had just failed. He had opened it in an old pub called the Hen and Chickens at 54 Borough High Street, but although it had gone under, he still had the keys, and the pub had deep cellars. The plan was to move the body there, where it would be undisturbed. Henry crept into the vacant house at 215 Whitechapel Road, lifted the floorboards, and retrieved the remains of Harriet Lane. He had proved as inept at covering up murder as he had at business, and he had buried her in chloride of lime, which is a preservative, rather than the quicklime that would have dissolved the body quickly. He knew he'd been noticed carrying her from the house, especially if she was in one piece, so he used a chopper to cut her up, placing the parts into 2 large canvas parcels. They were too heavy for him, so he asked one of his former employees, Alfred Stokes, to carry one of them. Stokes was surprised by its weight and noticed an unpleasant smell coming from it. Henry realised that they couldn't manage to walk as far as he'd hoped while lugging the packages, so he went off to hail a cab. Stokes took the opportunity to satisfy his curiosity and looked inside the parcel. We can only imagine his horror when he saw a severed human hand and other body parts inside. When the cab arrived, Wainwright jumped in and thanked Stokes for his trouble. Stokes ran after the cab and called out to 2 policemen to help him, but they thought he was drunk or mad and ignored him. Stokes managed to catch up when the cab slowed down. Wainwright had spotted his still living mistress, Alice Day, walking down the road, and bold as brass, he invited her to ride with him, smoking a cigar to mask the appalling smell. Eventually Stokes came across another policeman, and puffing and panting, managed to convince him to investigate. The cab was stopped and searched, and all was revealed. Wainwright was hung on 21st of December at Newgate Prison. As he stepped up to the gallows, he was said to have been calmly smoking, and stated to the crowd, "Come to see a man die, have you, curs?" His brother Thomas served 7 years in prison as an accessory to murder, although some people believed it was he who had been the real killer and that Henry had taken the blame. Wainwright had the dubious honour of being hung by the famous executioner William Marwood, who was in his sinister line of work between 1872 and 1883. He was the one to introduce the long drop method, calculating out the length of the rope depending on the convict's weight. This technique reduced the chances of prisoners struggling and suffocating to death slowly, and in most cases broke the neck instantly. Marwood did well out of his craft, receiving £10 for each execution, in addition to a salary of £20 a year, as well as being able to keep the prisoners' clothes. Bullets from Harriet Lane's skull, skin and hair samples, the chopper used to dismember the body, and even the cigar Wainwright was smoking when he was arrested, are all in Scotland Yard's Black Museum. If you were hoping to get up close and personal with the case, you'll be disappointed to hear that the museum is not usually open to the public. It seems that Wainwright got his wish for fame after all, but not in the way he imagined. Thank you for listening to this Murder Minis episode. I hope you enjoyed it. You may have noticed that some common themes from these 5 crimes include killers trying to cover up their murders, none of them very successful, and a couple of botched hangings. Interestingly, the subject of our final story was one of the first to be hung by the famous William Marwood, so he was at no risk of strangling slowly at the end of the rope. Something we've also learnt from these stories is, if you're trying to dispose of a body in a parcel or trunk, don't ask someone to try and help you carry it. They'll probably think it's a bit suspicious and call the police. Please let me know what you thought of this format, and if you'd like to see more Murder Minis episodes. You can tweet me at Prash's Murder Map, visit prashsmurdermap.com, or email me on prashsmurdermap@gmail.com. Join me next time when we'll journey to Le Mans in France to hear about 2 sisters who committed one of the most brutal crimes in French criminal history.